I mean, we all know that the IMF reform is long overdue, right? That a single country alone has a veto power. And, for China, which accounts for, 16, 17% of global GDP and 18%, 18.8% actually global trade, and with just outsized economic, weight, it only has like 6% of the voting share at the IMF, right? And again, you compare the global north and the global south. Again, the global south's voting share is by no means matched up with its economic size. And so I think it's clear that IMF needs to be reformed. The question is how. And as you just said, that the United States and other G7s, they strongly oppose any of these kinds of voting share changes, right? Because this is a zero sum game. But I think there are a couple things that I think Pan Gongsheng, of course, he talked about it's needed to in his words, the quota system needs to be realigned, and it needs to improve the governance and enhance its legitimacy and representativeness. So I think that is the key. I think the key is that if the IMF is not undergoing this kinds of reform, it will lose its relevance. It will lose its legitimacy. I think one of the things that you realize these days that for many developing countries, they would rather go to the bond market. They would rather pay tremendously higher interest rate to borrow privately instead of going to the IMF. It's because they know that they don't have the voice at the IMF. They know that IMF loans are always come with conditionalities and with certain punitive conditions. And so IMF becomes really the last resort, right, when it comes to countries in need of liquidity support. And so I think that in many ways undermines the relevance, right, and the need for existence for an institution like the IMF, right, because IMF is to bridge the short-term, balance payment liquidity needs, and yet countries don't go to IMF for such a need. So I think that is a very strong push for the IMF to reform. Some of my colleagues at the Global Development Policy Center also argue maybe what we need to do is not to directly confront the United States, knowing that the US would have the veto power and would not cooperate, but rather is to maybe reduce the voting shares of countries like Japan or Germany or France or others that are increasingly become smaller in terms of their economic size compared to emerging markets like Brazil, Turkey or others. So there may be different ways, different strategies going forward, but I think it is clear that the IMF and other Bretton Woods institutions were established when these developing countries were still very much colonized and they didn't have a voice back then. But things have changed. So the IMF and other Bretton Woods institutions need to update and need to reform, right, in order not to lose the relevance.